Washington Journal continues.
And joining us now is Valerie Wilson. She's the director of a program on race, ethnicity, and the economy at the Economic Policy Institute. And she's here to discuss EPI's new report on the Economic Inequality Gap for African Americans. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit about the report. What are the highlights of what you found about the economic position of African Americans?
So what we found in our report, progress can be measured in two ways. There's absolute progress in terms of whether or not African Americans today are doing better off than they were in 1968, but then there's relative progress. So relative to whites, have we closed the inequality gap any? And along both of those measures, the results are mixed. So on one hand, there has been significant absolute progress in areas like education, income, health, wages, even wealth to some extent. However, there has been much less relative progress with regards to closing the inequality gap with whites.
Okay, and for this segment, we do have special lines, for our viewers to join this conversation. If you are African American, you can call 202-748-8000, and all others can call 202-748-8001. Now, this report came out on the 50-year anniversary of the Kerner Commission report, and I want to play for our viewers a CBS News report on the release of the Kerner Commission report, and it was released in February of 1968, and we'll talk on the other side.
The American people are deeply disturbed. They are baffled and dismayed by the wholesale looting and violence that has occurred both in small towns and in great metropolitan centers. No society can tolerate massive violence any more than a body can tolerate massive disease. And we in America shall not tolerate it. We need to know the answer, I think, to three basic questions about these riots. What happened? Why did it happen? What can be done to prevent it from happening again and again?
In their answers to those questions, the President's Special Commission on Civil Disorders has confronted the American people with a new shock to our national sense of well-being, a shock and a warning. Our nation, says the report, is moving toward two separate societies, black and white, separate but unequal. If the division is allowed to widen, it says, we will find ourselves living in a state of tension and lawlessness held in check only by repression. In those words, the report summons up an image that is more like the other side of the Iron Curtain or the garrison states of Latin America than our image of the United States. In the riots of last summer, the Commission sees the whole shape of that danger. The violence of last summer, it says, was more white repression than Negro protest. There is only one hope, it says, of keeping disorder from taking over permanently, and that is to reverse the course of racism, which is its basic cause, to rub out the boundaries of the ghetto and relieve the poverty that breeds there. To do this in what the Commission calls a commitment to national action.
And you can watch the full CBS News special report on the Kerner Commission findings Saturday night at 10 p.m. Eastern on American History TV on C-SPAN 3. But Valerie, tell us the significance of doing the EPI report now, and how does it compare to the findings of the Kerner report 50 years ago?
So again, I think it's significant to consider that we've had 50 years since the Kerner Commission report was published. And unfortunately, it seems that many of the conclusions that were drawn then, 50 years ago, are still things that we can say today. We know that in a lot of our major cities across the country, there has been unrest. But we also know when we look at the data on economic outcomes that the level of inequality between blacks and whites is not very different than it was 50 years ago. In some areas, for example, home ownership, we're exactly in the same place. When we consider incarceration, we're much worse than we were in 1968. The incarceration rate among African Americans has nearly tripled since 1968. And then when we look at things like unemployment, we have this persistent 2-to-1 black-white unemployment gap that exists whether we're in good economic times or bad, and also exists at every level of education.
Okay, and we are talking with Valerie Wilson, the director of the program on race, ethnicity, and the economy at the Economic Policy Institute, about the new report on the economic inequality gap of African Americans. Again, if you are African American, you can call 202-748-8000. All others, 202-748-8001. I want to read a little bit from this report just to sort of highlight some of the things you were talking about. It says black workers still make only 82.5 cents on every dollar earned by white workers. African Americans are 2.5 more likely to be in poverty than whites, and the median white family has almost 10 times as much wealth as the median black family. In 2017, the black unemployment rate was 7.5%, up from 6.7% in 1968, and still roughly twice the white unemployment rate. In 2015, the black home ownership rate was just over 40%, virtually unchanged since 1968, and trailing a full 30 points behind the white home ownership rate, which saw modest gains over the same period. I want to break down a little bit further in our discussion, but I want to start out by saying President Trump frequently touts the fact that the black employment rate is better now than it has been in several decades. What do you say as evidence about how well black Americans are doing? What do you say to that?
Well, there are a couple issues with that sort of statement. One, it neglects the fact that, as I mentioned, the black unemployment rate is still roughly double the white unemployment rate. 7.5 may be better than it's been in several decades, but I would venture a guess that if the national unemployment rate was 7.5%, or even if the white unemployment rate was 7.5%, we would not be celebrating that. So the bar seems extremely low when it comes to black unemployment. Another thing I think is important to know about that is that we've gotten to this 7.5% over like the last 4 years. Over the course of the economic recovery. So I know that President Trump likes to take credit for that rate as well, and he really can't take credit because we were moving along that path long before he was in office or was even running for president.
All right, Kathleen is calling from Los Angeles, an African-American viewer. Kathleen, good morning.
Good morning, and I really don't even like to be referred to as an African American. I don't know how that got into our lexicon. I'm a black American, but the point that I would like to make is that during Jim Crow, before Jim Crow, black Americans had 87% two-parent families. After Jim Crow and being with the Democratic Party, we now have 25% two-parent families. Also, the other data point, I talk about data. Yeah, it will take 228 years for the average black family to catch up with the average white family. Why? For five decades, we voted Democrats. And we didn't focus on economics. We focused on race. Dr. Claude Anderson, I don't know why you don't have him on C-SPAN. He talks about economics. All the Democratic politicians talk about is racism. They never talk about economics. For 5 decades, if we had focused on economics, if we would have 5 decades of small businesses. The Democratic Party expects black Americans, black parents to put foreign kids, I'm in California, foreign kids over and above their own kids. See, the focus from the Democrats has been wrong for 5 decades. They have failed us. The Democratic Party has failed us. We need our fathers in our home. We need two-parent families.
All right. I want to give Valerie a chance to respond to that.
Well, what I will say to that is I think one of the things that came out of the Kerner Commission that they were recommending, they called massive and sustained investments in education and jobs. And I think that what is on target with that kind of recommendation is that they're addressing economic problems with economic solutions. And I think that is exactly what we need. I think too often, and a lot of the problems that led to the unrest in the 1960s and even today is that largely our government has been responding to economic programs with greater policing. They're addressing poverty by imposing more policing in communities. So I agree that we need economic focus to address economic problems.
All right. Thera is calling from Selma, Alabama, also an African-American viewer. Good morning.
Good morning. I wanted to talk about the crack is it came from Agent Orange when Bush Sr. sent all the troops over there to fight in Afghanistan and stuff. Then when they came back, that when crack and stuff came in. You could look back in the day when they put out swine as and hogs and stuff. We got to eat the guts and stuff. Then they did the tobacco. Then they went to bootlegging. Then they kept putting all this stuff out here. They knew it was bad, but they kept doing it. Even weed, that Indian was smoking rap tobacco, getting high off of it, and then now they're going to say that crack, how did it get here? It got here from Agent Orange, because Bush Sr. didn't want to take care of the blacks, so that way he pushed it in. They died. They found out about the poppy seed when they went over there to Afghanistan and stuff.
All right, I want to give Valerie a chance to talk about the impact of drugs and other things on the black community.
Yeah. I think that one of the things that we learned from the crack epidemic is just how unequal and unjust is the administration of quote-unquote justice in this country. We know that there were disparities in terms of penalties for crack cocaine versus powdered cocaine, and those penalties were weighted against African Americans. So that is largely what contributed to the rise in incarceration that we find in our report, and disproportionately so in African American communities. So I think one of the problems with that, one of the issues there, is that in a lot of poor black communities, people are considered just disposable. And so that is the challenge that we face with regards to drugs and how justice is administered with regards to drug policy.
So the Kerner Commission, the full name is the Kerner Commission, the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, which was created by President Lyndon Johnson to address, in the wake of very widespread unrest and racial tensions at that time. That report called for national action. So what was that, and what has worked since then to address some of these issues, and what hasn't?
Well, again, what they were recommending was a massive investment in education and jobs, specifically targeted for African Americans and in those communities. I think that the challenge that we face in looking back and whether or not that has been effective is that we haven't consistently met both of those objectives. I think the things that we have done at times have been too small, and also they haven't been sustained. We know that with politics, things tend to ebb and flow. During one administration, we may prioritize an issue, and then the next, it becomes something that is not a priority. So those investments haven't been nearly as consistent as they should be. I think the other thing that came out of the Kerner Commission, what was known as the Kerner ethos, is that everyone does better when everyone does better. And the problem that we've had with that is the legacy and ongoing issues around racism and sexism that are in direct opposition to that. Racism and sexism say that only certain groups of people get to do better. And those privileges, those advantages and disadvantages endure. So unless we do something to deliberately and intentionally shift that balance, then the problems continue from generation to generation.
Okay, Aaron is calling from St. Petersburg, Florida. Good morning, Aaron.
Hi, good morning, and thank you so much for C-SPAN. It's one of the best outlets for Americans to voice their freedom of speech, and thank you so much. I would like to make three statements really quick. The first statement is, if we try to go back to the very beginning of racism, we're going to have to go a long way back. So I try not to focus on that these days. What I'd like to look at for America is how President Obama had done such a wonderful job of unifying this country and its race relations. But except for one way, the Ku Klux Klan did not march for 8 years. At the moment Donald Trump got into power, they went to South Carolina, took off their hoods, put on a new marker, brought guns to South Carolina, and right in the face, in spite of all America they marched, and Heather Heyer died. Donald Trump incited that riot, incited that violence, and he has brought the backlash from the realistic and legitimate denial of allowing a racist group to protest with hate speech, which is not free speech, on America's streets.
All right. I want to give Valerie a chance to talk about that. We have seen an increase of more overt actions taken by white supremacists and other groups. What do you contribute that to, and how does this report address those issues?
I think what that says is that we have not made nearly as much progress on race relations in this country as we would like to think. I would disagree with the caller. I don't know that we made huge strides in race relations under President Obama. I think he was much better at addressing it and speaking about it in more eloquent terms, in terms that people could relate to. But in terms of what's actually going on in the country and how people relate to one another, I don't know that I would say that race relations got a lot better under his administration. I would agree, however, that a lot of what we're seeing now is some backlash. And, you know, that plays out in terms of the numbers that we report in our report. Again, racism, sexism have legacies. So it's difficult to say, oh, that happened long ago, let's not look at that. One, because it does still happen today. But also, like I said, a lot of the advantages and disadvantages that were put in place by those systems continue. Those things perpetuate themselves over generations. And unless we decide that we're going to shift the balance of power and undo those things, they're going to stay the way that they are and sometimes get worse.
So I want to dig down in some of the different areas that this report looks at, and I want to start first when it comes to straight economic issues that Black Americans are 2.5 times more likely to be in poverty, and also that the median white family has almost 10 times as much wealth, and particularly the issue of wealth. What is it about wealth attainment that is so difficult for Black Americans to get as opposed to other groups?
So I'm glad you asked that question, because the issue with wealth is related to exactly what I was saying about the legacy of racism and other effects. So wealth is important because it's there as a safety net. We use our wealth in times when we don't earn as much on a job, either because we've become disabled, we've become ill, we've gotten older and have retired. Wealth is there for people when they lose a job. But also wealth is available for families to fund higher education for their children, of course, to purchase a home. Home ownership is the single largest means of attaining assets in this country. And so when you lack wealth, you lack each of those things that I just described. And so another thing about the wealth gap is that inheritance plays a large role in the expansion of the gap. So if you come from a family who lacks wealth, there's very little wealth for them to pass on to you in the next generation. So each generation essentially starts over, and that gap just continues to widen and widen. And so wealth is very important when we consider economic well-being and how we address economic disparity. I will say, however, that was one of the areas where we found mixed results. The median Black family, or average Black family, does have just 10% of the wealth of the average white family. However, in 1968, it was 5%. So there's been, again, some absolute progress, but still a huge gaping gap in terms of wealth.
And what are the factors there? Is it earning potential? Is it access to business capital to start new business ventures? What is it about? What are the factors that keep Black people from attaining the same wealth as others?
I would say it's all of the above. I mentioned home ownership as being a major factor. And we know that in this country there was a period of time when home ownership was encouraged. It was promoted. It was subsidized even by the federal government. However, African Americans did not have access to those benefits. So that was a period in our history when the wealth gap expanded tremendously due to government policies. But also earnings, I mentioned inheritance, business ownership, all of these things are assets that contribute. But then on the other side is the debt side, because your net worth is the difference between your assets and your liabilities. We know that African Americans also, are burdened by a significant amount of debt, specifically with regards currently to student loans.
Jay is calling in from Lexington, South Carolina. Also, one of our black viewers. Jay, you are on with Valerie Wilson.
Yes, Valerie, I commend you on what you're doing. I would like to emphasize that what's really going on in the black situation is everything does start from the beginning. It started during slavery. When you think about how all the wealth had attained from the white ancestors who attributed wealth off the backbones of free slave labor, they obtained a lot of wealth. When all the immigrants came here, when you talk about race, they were racing here to get free labor and free land, and they obtained all this wealth. So black people it takes a while for us to catch up wealth-wise, because we were systematically, economically disenfranchised out of the whole system. And then when you think about the whole scenario, now all the other immigrants come in, and it seems like they're obtaining wealth over the African Americans. So you can look at it in so many different ways, but you have to go back to history. You have to read the Constitution, the way it was written. You have to go back and read the 1866 Indian Treaty that was written, and they allowed the Indians to enslave some of the African people. So, and the black codes that were put in place when you talk about Jim Crow laws and the Supreme Court system that was set up to block black people from achieving, and then social integration along with economic, judicial, every part of this diaspora system. Black people only attain 1/2 of 1% of wealth in this country, where white people attain by 80 to 90% of wealth.
Okay. Okay. I just want to give Valerie a chance to respond.
Yeah, I would agree with most of what you've said, that the current wealth gap we see is the result of a long history of exclusion and exploitation of African American labor and people in this country.
Okay, Chuck's on the line from New Mexico. Good morning.
Good morning. I have a different perspective. My family, my mother we came from Hawaii. I was born in Hawaii. My mother was Japanese. So we came to New Jersey in 1949. So I was raised in an environment where there was racism towards my mother. My mother was totally educated. She couldn't get a job, and on and on. Anyway, so we were desperately poor. I worked on a blueberry farm in New Jersey. And I observed, and we used to get people from Camden and Philadelphia that were bussed in, and they were black families. And the word got out that they were going to pass this aid to dependent children. And as soon as they passed aid to dependent children, those farms went out of business. Nobody would work again. And I noticed something, and I've Googled this, that the nuclear family was destroyed. It was, your first caller said 86% of the black family was mom and dad's. After that, it degenerated to what it is today, about 25%. And what's disturbing to me is the professor keeps giving excuses for people to fail. You could say racism or whatever. Everyone in my family, we were poor. We had holes in the roof. We could look up and see the sky and stuff like that. Everyone in my family went to college, but we had to work our way through. But what my mother gave us was the feeling of self-reliance. And I'm hearing from the professor, oh, no, it's not your fault. It's someone else's fault. I think if you give people the incentive or the courage to work hard, study, the hell with the racism business, because you can overcome that if it's the individual.
All right, I want to give Valerie a chance to respond.
Thank you. So I am by no means giving anyone an excuse to fail, and I would like to cite some of the statistics from our report, in fact. You mentioned education and the importance of education. I would say that compared to 1968, African Americans have made tremendous strides on education. In 1968, just slightly over half of African American young adults, those between the ages of 25 and 29, were high school graduates. Today, that's well over 90%. In 1968, about 9% of black young adults were college graduates. Today, that number is just under a fourth. So there have been tremendous gains in terms of education. So what that tells us is that education is important for economic mobility. I also said that we've made gains in income, in wages. The poverty rate, though still higher than whites, is significantly lower than it was in 1968. Education is important, and it's effective as a tool of economic mobility. Education alone has not been effective in terms of eliminating racial economic inequality. And so that's the point that we're making in our report. African Americans have made tremendous efforts, have done a lot to improve their economic standing. But it has not led to as much progress in terms of greater equality in this country.
Another aspect that your report looks at is the impact of incarceration on the position of the economic position of black Americans. What did you find?
So what we found with incarceration is that that number has grown. Now, interestingly, it's grown for both blacks and for whites. It's grown much faster for blacks for many of the reasons that I mentioned before in terms of the rise in mass incarceration during the 1980s and 1990s, largely associated with our nation's drug policy. And so what we have seen is that this rise in incarceration has effects on individuals and communities post-incarceration. And when people are released, they have problems getting housing, they have problems getting jobs. And so that has a significant effect on not only those individuals in terms of their ability to earn and support themselves, but also for the families that they come from and the communities in which they live. So that's a major problem that I think we need to address as well as we talk about criminal justice reform.
All right. Robert is calling from Worcester, Massachusetts, another African-American viewer. Good morning.
How are you? I would like to say the best host that ever came on C-SPAN was Susan. Everybody talked about this, but Susan was the best. Let me go. But kudos to Susan. I want to go to talk about when we get down to black Americans. Remember, we're black Americans. Don't call me an African American. That's the worst thing you can do to a black American, to say African American. We're Americans. Now, we're going to start with, you remember the old days, Reconstruction, when we were supposed to get 40 acres in a mule? Do you remember that? We were supposed to get 40 acres in a mule. No, who took that 40 acres in a mule? We gave it to the Amish. We gave it to the people in Utah. You know, the Mormons. Sitting on my 40 acres in a mule. Today, they ought to give me 10 tractors and 100 acres. That's what they owe me. So you ladies can say what you want to say. And let me say one more thing. This will be the end of this. Miss Kimberly, you was on last Saturday on the same station I'm talking to right now. The same day you was on MSNBC with the same dress, let me remind you. Now, I know your opinion because you explain your opinion to everybody to the world. You're also a Fox contributor. Now, this station should not have anybody from MSNBC or Fox.
All right. I want to give Valerie a chance to respond to the issues that you brought up. Go ahead.
So we talked a little bit earlier about backlash in terms of race relations, at least. And I think with regards to the period of Reconstruction, that's a lot of what happened there as well. Again, African Americans, black Americans, whatever term you want to use, black folk were advancing or at least making some gains during this period. And that was disheartening or not looked upon as a positive thing by many white Southerners. And then we had the rise of the Klan and all of the domestic terrorism that went on against black people in this country, and stripping of a lot of the economic gains and political gains that we were able to attain during that period. And so, yes, African Americans were exploited during the period of slavery, during Jim Crow, and continue to be in this country. But I think we cannot lose sight of the fact that, progress is extremely slow because we have this process by which any gains are ultimately perceived as a threat in some other communities, and then we have some backlash against that. So there's always this sort of tension and back and forth in terms of progress.
All right, Ernest is calling from Decatur, Georgia. Good morning, Ernest.
Good morning. How you doing?
I'm good. You're on with Valerie. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. My name is Chief Ernest Marshall. I'm chief of the Black Creek Muskogee Nation. I lived in segregation 21 years. My birth certificate says colored. So colored, Negro, African American, Black American, it don't matter. I'm an indigenous person who's struggled in this country. I'm also a researcher in the National Archives, looking for bonds and treasury notes and land ownership and so forth. But to answer her question about economics, we got to look at what Dorchester, Bank of America, and the rest of those banks did when it came to redlining black communities with zip codes and telephone numbers. We also must think about how the banks started doing the domino effect when it came to taking houses and reselling them. And we also have a problem when World War II, we would not have black people during the time of the war to even do professional jobs or only indigenous jobs. We also have to talk about what happened with the 1866 treaties and the Treaty of Paris, like the gentleman said earlier. We have been blocked by a lot of laws that have been put before us to make sure that we didn't find the information we needed to get money in our neighborhood. Segregation was a point of it haven't ended. We still don't have the permanent right to vote.
And Ernest, I want to give Valerie a chance to address that point, and something I wanted to ask about is things like access to capital. Talk about the importance of that, and where do you see that going?
So, access to capital is important because that's one of the avenues by which people have to build wealth, to start businesses, to purchase property, to make other sorts of investments that are going to be appreciating in value and contributing to wealth. So access to capital is definitely critical when we talk about wanting to address the wealth gap. And yes, we know during the period when we had the housing boom and ultimately the bursting of the housing bubble, that there were a lot of unscrupulous practices that a number of banks engaged in, and they're quite frankly, currently are unscrupulous practices that Wells Fargo has been accused and found guilty of engaging in. So that does go on, and it is an impediment in communities for building wealth and in strengthening their economic security.
All right, Teresa is on from Alpine, California. Just a couple minutes left. What's your question for Valerie Wilson?
Am I on?
Yes, go ahead. Just a couple minutes.
I just would like her to respond to the other problems because I'm hearing what she's saying, but having grown up in the military where all different types of people got along and then working a job where, in the beginning of 20 years, everybody got along so well, and then it turned into where it was almost like this tribalism people talk about, where if you don't agree with everything a black person says in a work environment, then you get shunned, and they even try to get you in trouble. And the rhetorical question of, have you worked with black people lately? That could be a lot of the problem. Statistically, in the past, I would have agreed with what you're saying, but things have just gotten way too difficult, and I'm calling from California, so I'd like your response to that, what that plays in. It's the constant victimization all the time, and I don't understand how that benefits at all, because if things not only are getting better, but statistics can be skewed so much, it's hard to believe anything anymore. It just sounds like the same thing over and over, no matter what.
All right, I want to give Valerie Wilson a chance to respond. Go ahead.
Well, I think, people have a right to voice their concerns, to voice their experience, and to be frustrated and discontented about it. I don't think that there is any new problems in terms of race in this country and how black people feel with regards to opportunities and access to opportunities for advancing themselves, for opportunities to make a better life. Everyone in this country wants the same thing, and so I think that a lot of what happens often is that people feel that their concerns, their complaints are invalidated or dismissed. And I think that's where we get some of the tensions that go on in terms of conversations. But, I'm an economist. I focus on the data and what the numbers say. And quite frankly, the numbers in our report show that, again, there's been absolute progress in education, but that progress and those gains in education have not resulted in the kind of progress in economics that we would expect. And when that doesn't happen, we're left with the question of why not? And in a number of studies that I have done, controlling for any number of factors that could reasonably affect someone's wages, for example. We did a major report on the black-white wage gap in 2016. There's just no way of accounting for why that difference exists apart from there being this persistent racial disparity, racial gap. And, that could be things that we just can't measure or control for in data, but it could also be something very real, which is racial discrimination.
Okay, Valerie Wilson, Director of the Program on Race, Ethnicity, and the Economy at EPI. You can find the report at epi.org, and you can find Valerie on Twitter at Valerie R. Wilson. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And coming up next,